The format of the evening is that we're going to have a opening prayer from Laudato Si, and Sister Elizabeth is going to lead us in that. I'm going to take a minute to introduce Dan after the prayer, and then the presentation. So as we prepare to pray, I would ask everybody if they could just take a nice deep breath and relax and enter into God's presence. The work that we do, the inspiration that we have, comes from our triune God through the Holy Spirit. So if in our exhale we would just invoke that prayer, come, Holy Spirit, come. And with that, Sister Elizabeth, if you could lead us in prayer.
Thank you. This prayer is partly from the end of Laat. Pope Francis leaves us with a closing prayer. It calls us to action and to be open to the Holy Spirit and to realize what we have. Triune Lord, wondrous community of infinite love, teach us to contemplate you in the beauty of the universe, for all things speak of you. Awaken our prayers, praise, and thankfulness for every being that you have made. Give us the grace to feel profoundly joined to everything that is. God of love, show us our place in this world as channels of your love for all the creatures of this earth, for not one of them is forgotten in your sight. Enlighten those who possess power and money, that they may avoid the sin of indifference, that they may love the common good, advance the weak, and care for this world in which we live. The poor in the earth are crying out, O Lord, seize us with your power and light. Help us to protect all life, to prepare for a better future, for the coming of your kingdom of justice, peace, love, and beauty. Praise be to you. Amen.
Amen. Okay, I'd like to introduce Dan very briefly. Dan DiLeo has a PhD in moral theology. He is an associate professor and the director of the Justice and Peace Studies program at Creighton University. He specializes in Catholic social teaching and climate change, and has been consultant to the Catholic Climate Covenant since 2009. I read Dan's paper a month ago in the NCR, and I was just so excited that he put together both Catholic social teaching and action. And I'm within hours, I got him on the text message and said, would you come and talk to the Catholic Action team? And he said yes. So we're very excited to have Dan do his presentation for us and explain the wonderful paper and inspire us to get out there and take some action in our church and help move our church forward. So with that, Dan, I'm going to stop sharing and allow you to take over.
All right. Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you, everyone, for joining tonight, especially those from CCL. The work that's gone into this and plan everything has just been fantastic. So I'm just extraordinarily grateful. And I think it was my hope, in a sense, that something like this would come from the article, especially from CCL, in the sense that CCL really already does this. And by this, I mean values-based, narrative-based climate advocacy. And in a lot of ways, what this vision is to turn what CCL does outward in society inward toward the church, out of mission fidelity. And so, in terms of what we're going to cover tonight, the goal and the outcome is really to develop the theological foundations of what I'm going to call encounter-based Catholic advocacy for a diocesan Laudato Si action platform commitment and a net zero policy. We talked a lot about what could and should go into the presentation tonight, and really felt, and Steve especially, that what would be most helpful for you all is to describe the theological foundations of how and why this model of advocacy can and should be used by Catholics in their own diocese. There will be a separate follow-up opportunity to really dig into the organizing model and some of the strategies and tools for that, many of which the CCL folks already have. But tonight is really going to be a focus on the theology. I'm going to say up front, we are going to do a whole lot in not a lot of time. And I am unapologetic about that, because we've got one chance together to really dig into this. So if at the end of this, you would like to call Creighton, advocate for course credit, I will support that, because you're going to be getting a lot of theology. The way that I want to proceed is essentially in 4 different parts. And as Steve said, I'll stop after each and just check in for understanding. We'll leave some of the discussion for later on. But I want to start by outlining what we're going to talk about as the ecclesiology and missiology, the study of the church and study of the church's mission, to really understand and get a sense of how ecological justice is essential to the church's mission. It's not an optional add-on. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll move into what I'm going to describe as mission fidelity through ecclesial social justice. So we're going to start to turn this vision of advocacy inward towards the church itself. Then we'll look specifically at advocacy for enrollment in the Vatican's Laudato Si action platform and a commitment to net zero. And then we'll talk about synodality as a particular way of advocating for this in a way that, as you'll see, is explicitly supported by the Vatican. So this is where we're going to go tonight. But in order to kind of establish the foundation of this work, I want to begin by some of the fruits that this approach has yielded. In 2020 and 2021, 2 of my students had the extraordinary opportunity to present to Pope Francis about the concerns of young Catholics in the United States around climate change. So this is a once-in-a-lifetime picture of my then student, Emily Burke, presenting to Pope Francis virtually. And as I said to her after, when your student has lectured the Pope, there's nothing else your professor can tell you. So she was smooth sailing through the rest of her college career. Out of this, then Bishop Zinkula in the Diocese of Davenport contacted Emily and Henry, my 2 students, and wanted a follow-up conversation about what they had told the Holy Father and what that might mean for his diocese in Iowa. This excerpt comes from the diocese now Laudato Si action plan that describes that the students asked Bishop Zinkula to respond to the challenge of climate change and develop plans for achieving net zero carbon emissions. The bishop committed to such action. In other words, this values-based narrative advocacy has already gotten the church to move in this direction. Some of you may be familiar with the Catholic Climate Covenant's initiative, the Common Home Corps, that's essentially trained Catholics in dioceses to advocate for enrollment in the Laudato Si action platform, as well as the decarbonization commitment. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Laudato Si action platform. I'll say more about that later. But in terms of applying this model of values-based advocacy over the last year, there are several dioceses that our Common Home leaders have worked in and really help secure a commitment to this initiative. So in Kansas City, St. Joseph, Fort Wayne, South Bend, Stockton, and then here in the Archdiocese of Omaha, we've gotten concrete commitments by using this model of values-based advocacy. And then hopefully folks have seen the extraordinary news that came yesterday that in the Diocese of Lexington, Kentucky, Bishop John Stowe has made an extraordinary commitment in the heart of coal country by which the diocese pledges to reach net zero emissions across all its 59 parishes, as well as schools and institutions in the next 6 years. By comparison, the Diocese of Davenport, which is extraordinary in its own right, has committed its chancery operations to net zero by 2050. So one facility with a 2050 goal. Lexington is doing everything by 2030. And this comes out of this engagement with narrative-based, values-based advocacy. So what we're going to talk about tonight has really proven effective, and those in CCL know that this has also been the case in civil society. So to begin the conversation, I want to essentially dump out the box of puzzle pieces and spread it out on the table to get a sense of the terms that we're going to be working with. We're going to use these terms and the way that the church defines them to really carefully and systematically build the case for why Catholics ought to be advocating with their bishops. So we're going to go through this very systematically. And I want to begin with the church's definition of faith. And you're going to notice a lot of text tonight, and you're going to notice a lot of citations. I do this because I want you all to really be empowered in terms of understanding how deeply rooted this is in the church's own teaching, and that this isn't just the gospel according to Dan. So you're going to get a lot of text, and folks will have access to this afterwards. In the Catholic tradition, in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we formally define faith as the adequate response to God's love. That adequacy is going to come back when we talk about climate science in terms of a response that's commensurate with climate science. When we speak about the church, we're talking about the people of God from the Second Vatican Council's document Lumen Gentium. We're talking about all the baptized, not just the magisterium. The church is all the baptized. And this church, this community, lives by the law of love. We're called to love one another as God loves us. This is the basic understanding of the church. And in the Catholic tradition, drawing from St. Thomas Aquinas, we talk about love as willing and acting for the good. And the good is understood as flourishing, as the fulfillment of potential. You can think about that in terms of the flourishing of the non-human environment. So love is willing and acting. So the church exists to act in this way, to act adequately in light of what's currently happening. Given these terms, we can start to talk about the church's end. It exists for a purpose, and Lumen Gentium describes the purpose is to build God's kingdom. The kingdom of God begun by God on earth, which is to be further extended. And when we talk about the kingdom in this way, we're actually echoing the Our Father in many ways. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The church exists to build God's kingdom. When we talk about the kingdom, we're not talking in abstract theory. The church gives specific content to God's kingdom. In the Council document Gaudium et Spes, we're talking about a kingdom of truth and life, a kingdom of holiness and grace, a kingdom of justice, love, and peace. Starting to put these pieces together, the church exists to build this kind of world here and now. That is part of the church's mission. That is the church's mission. When we start to think about justice, love, and peace, we can also recognize that care for God's creation is essential to this vision of the kingdom. As St. John Paul II described, creation care is an essential part of Christian faith. It's not an optional or a secondary add-on. And so bringing this all together, Francis in Laudato Si describes that peace, justice, and the preservation of creation are three absolutely interconnected themes which cannot be separated and treated individually. So the church exists to build this kind of world, this kingdom that includes ecological sustainability. When we start to talk about this, we can move into the idea of ecological justice, and we can do that in a way that formally describes the church's mission. The church's mission from the council document Ad Gentes is to advance and to embody God's kingdom, of which ecological justice is an essential part. And that word embodiment, we can talk about incarnation, is going to be essential to this model of advocacy. The church doesn't just call others to this. The church's mission is to embody this. When we talk about how the church lives this mission, the term that we use is evangelization. This is a term that at least I grew up with in a very narrow, I would say, is impoverished sense. That evangelization for me growing up as a cradle Catholic was speaking, right? I'm going to tell people about my faith. I'm going to tell people about Jesus. That's not how the church itself defines evangelization. In Lumen Gentium, evangelization is defined as the announcing of Christ by a living testimony, as well as by spoken word. In other words, evangelization requires action, action that advances and embodies God's kingdom. In other words, the church is called, as Lumen Gentium goes on, to be on earth the initial budding forth of that kingdom. In other words, the church's mission is to embody Catholic social teaching, of which creation care is essential. So when we put all these pieces together, we arrive at one of the seminal understandings of the church's mission that came in the 1971 document Justitia in Mundo. Action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world fully appear to us as a constitutive dimension of the preaching of the gospel, or in other words, of the church's mission. Action for justice to transform the world is essential to the church's mission. It's not an optional add-on or secondary to personal piety. This is essential to who the church is, all the baptized. In the Ignatian tradition, we speak about this in terms of the faith that does justice. And so if you are familiar with the Jesuits from General Congregation 35, they describe the service of faith and the promotion of justice indissolubly united remain at the heart of our mission. And that idea of faith and justice brings us back to our first definition of faith as the adequate response to God's love. The service of faith requires an adequate response to the signs of the times, what's happening around us. That's part of the church's mission, which in a sense isn't anything new, because we read in chapter 2 of Letter of James that faith without works is dead. So all of this puts together a picture of the church's mission by which we can summarily say that action to advance and embody ecological justice is essential to the fullness of the church's mission. I'm going to say that again. Action to advance and embody ecological justice is essential to the fullness of the church's mission. So as Steve said, I want to stop intermittently, not for discussion. We can have discussion later on in the evening, but just to check for understanding, give people a moment to pause, kind of process either some of these terms that may be new or that may be presented in a different way that you've not heard them presented before. So I want to see, are there any clarifying questions, just objectively in terms of content or material that's been presented? Is there anything that folks would like some clarity on, terms or ideas that they'd like sharpened before we move to the second part?
And I would remind you, if you could just type those into the chat, and Peter will give them voice.
Dan, I'm not seeing, either we have fantastic students or people are slow typers. I'm not seeing too many questions yet.
Right. Well, I'll keep moving then, but feel free, if folks do have questions, to put those in the chat. We'll stop again in a little bit. If we need to double back and address something from this first section, I'm happy to do that. So we've built this vision of the church by which its mission is to advance God's kingdom that entails ecological sustainability. From there, I want to move into mission fidelity by way of ecclesial social justice. And this is really the turn to Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm hoping this is going to be especially familiar or feel familiar. In order to do this, I want to give a precise definition to politics. Politics, from the Greek politika, means affairs of the city. For our purposes, we can talk about politics as any activity that organizes and structures any community. And I think this is an important definition because it gives a more expansive notion to what politics and advocacy really are. Politics and advocacy exist in civil society for sure, but given this definition, they also exist, for example, in a university, right? We have policies that organize and structure our community, and people, students or others, can advocate to change those policies. Families, by this definition, are also political. If our kids, we've got 3 young boys, 8, 6, and 2, if they do something that breaks our family rule, there's a consequence. They may advocate to change the policy, but our family is political. It can't not be if we're going to structure life together. This is important because it sets up the importance of politics in the Catholic tradition. And here, I think the US bishops in their document, Economic Justice for All, summarize it when they say dignity can be realized and protected only in community. In our teaching, the human person is not only sacred, but also social, made by love, for love, to love. The implication is that how we organize our society in economics and politics, in law and policy, directly affects human dignity and the capacity of individuals to grow in community. All of this is a kind of built out way of describing what the theologians Ken and Michael Himes put in simpler terms: politics matter because people matter, right? Politics matter for Christians because it concerns the temporal well-being of God's children, whom Christians are called to love. The law of the church is to love. Based on this definition, the US bishops go on, they describe that participation in political life is a moral obligation. But here, I think we can extend this to begin to think about political participation, not only in civil society, but also in the life of the church. We can also use this framework to pivot into developing our notion of love, but also introducing the term social justice. We've already seen love from Thomas Aquinas as willing and acting for the good. We tend to think about love as direct and interpersonal, and that's true. But the Catholic tradition also talks about a social dimension of love. And Francis in Laudato Si describes this when he says, love, willing and acting for the good, love affects not only relationships between individuals, but also macro relationships, social, economic, and political ones. So he goes on and he says, in this framework, along with the importance of everyday little gestures, social love moves us to devise larger strategies. In other words, love entails political action. In the Catholic tradition, we refer to this as social justice. And this introduces, or is a way to introduce, this resource from the US Conference of Catholic Bishops when they talk about the 2 feet of love and action. If we're going to talk about journeying by love, we can do so with the foot, quote unquote, of what we traditionally call charitable works. This is direct interpersonal service. This is meeting basic needs. This is providing a meal to someone experiencing homelessness. And in the Catholic tradition, this is necessary, but alone it's insufficient because charitable works always have to be complemented by social justice, which work to reform systems and structures and policies that avoid the need for charitable works in the first place. So as we accompany someone experiencing homelessness, we say, why is this happening? Is it because this person lacks access to safe and affordable housing or healthcare? If so, while we serve them a meal, we might also thinking about advocating for structural reform. And here we can use the idea of politics as changing structures to now begin to think about ecclesial social justice. Social justice in society changes civil policies, but ecclesial social justice begins to try and change church policies. And this is where we can really dig into CCL really as a model for ecclesial social justice. When we talk about church policies in this way, we can also introduce some additional terms from moral theology. We can think about church policies as what the theologian Kevin Hearn describes as structures of grace, institutions that are pathways by which God's grace enters into the world and advances God's kingdom. We can also think about policies, though, in terms of what the church calls structures of sin. In the Catholic tradition, sin most basically is a failure to love. It's a failure to will and act for the good. We think about sin like love in terms of interpersonal, but we can also think about failures to love, that is to say sin, in terms of structures. And this is how the Catechism describes it. structures of sin are social institutions and situations that lack social love, that lack social justice. And here we can make a distinction using the traditional categories of sin. We can talk about sins of commission. These are structures that actively promote and enact unloving policies. So think about segregationist policies in the Jim Crow South in the 1950s, right? Active segregation. We can also, though, talk about sins of omission, which are a failure to pursue loving policies. It's failing to do what we could and should do, either in society or within the church. This is what Francis in Laudato Si describes as the sin of indifference, and what the theologian Jim Keenan describes as the failure to bother to love. So when we think about the church as having its own internal policies, it opens up this front to begin to think about the church as a place of structures of grace or structures of sin, especially when the church fails to have policies that are adequate responses to God's love, that are faithful. This raises questions about fidelity. It also, though, raises questions about credibility. And I think this is an important point that I'll come back to, especially when thinking about young people. But again, this comes from the church's own teaching. Going back to the document Justitia in Mundo, the bishops write, "For unless the Christian message of love and justice shows its effectiveness through action in the cause of justice in the world, it will only with difficulty gain credibility with the people of our times. If we are not embodying the message that we preach, we won't have credibility in society or within the church itself." And so for this reason, the document goes on and says the church is obliged to live and administer its own goods in such a way that the gospel is proclaimed to the poor. If instead the church appears to be among the rich and powerful of this world, its credibility is diminished. And I've bolded that word administer for a couple of reasons. Number one, the church administers through its own internal policies, its own internal energy policies, and its own internal financial policies. I also bold the word administer because administration is one of the three offices to which a bishop is ordained. As I'll say in a minute, the episcopal offices are teaching, sanctifying, and governing. Governing means administering a diocese. Here we can move further into ecclesiology as a way to kind of clarify what's going on here. The theologian Rick Gallardi describes the church visually as a kind of spoken wheel. You've got the Bishop of Rome, the local church of Rome at the center, and in each one of these larger circles, you've got a diocese. So each one of these dioceses is led by the local bishop, and within each circle, you can see the little stars as parishes. So the church in this way is a kind of ordered communion, as it were. Within this ordering, there are different vocations. The vocation of the bishop, and again, I'm using the church's own documents. This is Christus Dominus from Vatican II. Bishops are ordained as apostolic successors to teach, sanctify, and govern a diocese. So they are the successors to the apostles who are called to administer diocesan resources through faithful policies that embody church teaching. That's part of the responsibility of a bishop, to have diocesan policies that adequately respond to God's love. We also have priests who, as Presbyterorum Ordinus describes, are ordained as co-workers with the bishops. For our purposes, we can think about priests as administering parish resources through faithful parish policies that embody church teaching. So parishes have their own internal policies, they have their own finance councils. We can also then think about the laity and the religious who, as the Synod describes in its document moving us towards October 24, exercise differentiated co-responsibility in the mission of the church. We talked about the church as the people of God. The church's mission is to advance God's kingdom. Bishops have a role, priests have a role, but laity and religious have co-responsibility in the mission of the church. For our purposes tonight, we can think about this in terms of the responsibility to encourage and support bishops and priests in their responsibilities, in their faithful administration of diocesan and parish resources through faithful internal policies that embody church teaching. And here we can introduce another term. We can start to talk about the sensus fide, or sensus fidei, or sensus fidei fidelium, however you maybe have heard it. Sensus fidei is a sense of the faith. It's the idea that all the baptized have an intuitive, natural sense of the faith. Sensus fidei fidelium is the idea that all the church collectively has a shared sense of the faith. It also sets up the recognition that if faith is the adequate response to God's love, that all the baptized have a sense of what an adequate response entails, especially in terms of internal church policies. And it starts to give a firm foundation from which Catholics, living out the sensus fidei fidelium, can begin to think about ecclesial advocacy. Catholics having an intuitive sense of what faith requires and recognizing their co-responsibility might require them to meet with church leaders and advocate for reform, social justice of the church's own internal policies. So that was a lot of content. That was a lot of terminology. That was a fair amount of Latin. So I'm going to pause again and ask if there are clarifying questions. Again, not questions for discussion. We'll have more time for discussion later. But in terms of checking in for understanding and seeing if folks would like some clarity or some more precision with some of these terms, are there any terms, concepts, or ideas from the second part that folks would like developed or unpacked a little bit?
You may have, we're getting some questions. I'd encourage folks to write in more. I'll field a few that are coming in, and there's many others that are discussion level questions, but let's ask, is ecological conservation part of the responsibility mandated by God in the book of Genesis, where he mandates us to subdue and multiply?
So that's a great question. So in Genesis 1:26, we read the words having dominion over creation and subduing creation. The Hebrew for those words is essential to understanding what's being communicated there. Having dominion in Hebrew is radah. Radah is, in a sense, delegated responsibility. So you can think about the United Nations ambassador is delegated to exercise authority, but it's always on behalf of the greater authority. So having dominion in a Christian sense, in a Judeo-Christian sense, means that we exercise responsibility not for our own sake or by our own terms, but on behalf of God, who is creator, sustainer, and is love. So dominion isn't license for unbridled exploitation. The word in Hebrew subdue is kabash. You might have heard put the kabash on it. Kabash means to neutralize a hostile threat. So if somebody comes at me and attacks me and I grab them and pin them to the ground, I've neutralized the threat. If I begin to assault them and I beat them until they're unconscious or worse, I've clearly done more than just subdue the threat, right? I've done violence to that person. If you put yourself in the mind of the biblical author writing Genesis, the earth is a pretty hostile place. People are one animal attack or one famine or drought away from some pretty difficult conditions. So you can imagine why the author might use the word subdue, but subdue does not entail license for unbridled violence towards creation. And Francis talks about this in Laudato Si, that Genesis 1:26 is really kind of put in context by Genesis 2:15, where God calls us to care for creation. Right? So this idea of caring, cultivating, tilling really balances out and hopefully cancels out any notion that dominion and subdue are license for unbridled exploitation. So hopefully that helps give a little bit of clarity. It's a really good question. It comes up a lot in these conversations.
Thank you, Dan. There's a number of questions about how to, I'll paraphrase a couple of them, or a couple, three. How do we highlight the sin of omission when so much focus in kind of traditional Catholic teaching may be focused more on sin of commission, actually sins that you can actually grab? Could you speak to that and how you do that while being polite and cognizant of the need for love?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I would frame it using the title of two books, one by Michael Himes, Doing the Truth in Love, and another by the theologian Kathleen Caveney, Prophecy Without Contempt. I think doing the truth in love means speaking charitably, but candidly, especially recognizing what we're going to talk about here in a little bit as the vocation of the prophet is to name the gap between the standard of the community and how we're currently living. And all the baptized have this prophetic responsibility. So this really comes through some of these conversations that we're going to talk about in terms of relational advocacy. We need to build a relationship of trust with priest or the bishop in order to begin to have some of these difficult conversations, which is something that I know CCL folks know well in terms of relational advocacy.
Thanks, Dan. Feel free to stop me if you want to move on, but I've got a couple more. Steve asks, is the structure of the church why we should focus on bishops?
In my reading of it, yes. If and we can get more into this in the discussion, but in terms of advocacy, faith-based advocacy, I don't know if you could think up an organization better structured for collective advocacy. I mean, by definition, you've got a center of power around which you've got related but distinct communities that can come together and collectively advocate for an action that in turn can shape what happens in all these other spaces. So rather than focus on the priest at the parish, if people from lots of parishes collectively organized and focused on the bishop, getting the bishop who has oversight over entities across the diocese, I think would be a way to really realize the unfulfilled potential of the church to live its mission through structural change. And I'll talk about that here.
Okay, I would suggest we move on so we don't run out of time.
Sure. So we've done a lot so far, and now I want to pivot further into this idea of advocacy around a specific ask. And again, I know CCL folks know this well in terms of having a specific ask. When we think about what Catholics might do, we built this foundation that I want to put here again, that action to advance and embody ecological justice through faithful church policies that embody church teaching is essential to the fullness of the church's mission. So we've got this, we've built this foundation. Here, I want to just put front of mind the church's teaching on climate change specifically as a way to build up an adequate advocacy ask. So we know that in 1990, St. John Paul II described the greenhouse effect having reached crisis proportions. So this isn't anything new. Over his papacy, Pope Benedict XVI talked about climate change repeatedly, asking in 2010, for example, can we remain indifferent before the problems associated with such realities as climate change? And here in the United States, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the USCCB, has repeatedly talked about climate change, especially in this 2001 document, Global Climate Change, a plea for dialogue, prudence, and the common good. And I'm going to come back to prudence here in the next slide. So we talk about ecological justice generally, but now we can really start to talk about advocating for climate justice. In order to do this, I want to play a kind of wordsmith with one of the most important sentences in Pope Francis's recent document, Laudate Deum, on the climate crisis, which he released on October 4th of 24. He describes why he took the unprecedented step of writing a follow-up document. He says, 8 years have passed since I published the encyclical letter Laudato Si. Yet with the passage of time, I have realized that our responses have not been adequate. If we think about faith as the adequate response to God's love, my reading is that Francis is saying our responses to Laudato Si have not been faithful, right? As a society, but also as a church. Here we can start to unpack the idea of an adequate response by using that term prudence. In the Catholic tradition from Thomas Aquinas, prudence is a cardinal virtue defined as right reason applied to action. We act in light of the best available information, which means, as the bishops describe, that an adequate response is congruent with the best available information. For our purposes tonight, we can say that faithfulness is an adequate, that is to say, a science-based response through church policies. So now we can take the foundation that we built and start to add on to it and say that faithful, science-based church climate policies are essential to the fullness of the church's mission, for which bishops are preeminently responsible. So we're systematically going through building the case for science-based advocacy, calling for internal church policies that respond to the climate science. So we can take this now and put it at the top and start to ask, well, what is climate science saying? What is an adequate response? The Nobel Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change identifies the benchmarks of an adequate, prudent response. The IPCC describes that to have at least a 50% chance to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which at this point is likely unrealizable, but to minimize overshoot, we need to cut emissions in half from 2019 levels by 2030, and we need to reach net zero carbon by about 2050. And net zero, I think, is important to describe as different from carbon neutral, because carbon neutral allows for up to 100% of offsets. So you don't change anything, you just plant more trees. Net zero means a 90% reduction in direct emissions before offsetting the last 10%. So net zero is a much higher standard. This net zero decarbonization is in many ways the most direct way to address the climate crisis. And there's certainly other ways to do that. I know folks from LSM especially are familiar with the value and the importance of divestment as a strategy for catalyzing decarbonization. For our purposes tonight, I'm focusing more on the direct opportunity for the church to decarbonize through its own internal policies. So we've now developed this notion of faithful, science-based church climate policies as essential to the fullness of faith, to the church's mission. This is something that Pope Francis is living by example. He has committed his diocese, the Diocese of Rome, to be net zero carbon by 2050. There are also other Catholic entities that are making this commitment. For example, Common Spirit Health, which is the parent system to CHI, Catholic Health Initiative here in Omaha, has committed to have its system reach net zero carbon by 2040, so 10 years ahead of that 2050 deadline. So we can talk about this in terms of ecclesial fidelity, but this begins to raise an irony and, frankly, the prospect of hypocrisy and the opportunity for prophetic advocacy. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops in November, around the COP meeting, described that decarbonization is the preeminent environmental challenge. So this is the bishop's own teaching, and yet today, only 2 of the 178 Latin Rite U.S. Catholic dioceses have made any sort of net zero commitment, have established an internal church policy that is congruent with the science, that is faithful, that is prudent. You saw those at the beginning, the Diocese of Lexington committing its entire buildings portfolio, following the Diocese of Davenport having committed its chancery operations to net zero. So Steve mentioned the NCR piece that I did, but for Earth Day last week, I did a piece for America Magazine that unpacked all of this. And I want to put here, because in light of everything that we've said, my contention is that any bishop's failure to explore and implement feasible decarbonization policies is, I believe, a sin of omission. It's a failure to do what the church should and could do. Bishops are preeminently responsible for the church's mission, but we've also seen that all other Catholics exercise differentiated co-responsibility. So while we can talk about a bishop's sin of omission, we also need to recognize that so too is the failure by lay people to exercise this co-responsibility for the church's mission through synodal encounter and accountability. In my nearly 15 years of climate change work in the U.S. Church, I know of only a few Catholics who have met with their bishop and advocated for diocesan decarbonization. So in terms of a sin of omission, a failure to do what we could and should do, this falls on all of us as church. And this failure, I think, becomes even more stark when we look at what's happening in broader society. Folks are hopefully aware of the Climate Pledge, an initiative by more than 450 companies that have committed to net zero by 2040, which again is 10 years ahead of the 2050 deadline. And these are not mom and pop shops. These are some of the world's largest transnational corporations. They have made this internal policy commitment. And you saw that my students are pretty smart, having presented to Francis. In light of all this, some of the students here at Creighton sent a letter to senior administrators a couple of years ago in which they said that if profit-motivated corporations are prudently committed to net zero by 2040, our mission-motivated Jesuit Catholic university should also commit. So in terms of the church living its own mission, young people are putting the pieces together. I can say that from experience in the classroom. I can say that from experience with students, but I can also point you to what students have said themselves. I mentioned that Emily presented directly to Francis. Following their address, she and Henry published an article in Religion News Service, and this is how they summarized their address to Francis. Young people value authenticity and deplore hypocrisy. We told Pope Francis that U.S. Catholic leaders' failure to share and enact the church's own climate teachings is causing many in our generation to become disillusioned with the church. Young people are seeing misalignment in terms of the church and the church's own mission, the church's action and its failure to embody its own teaching. This failure, I think, is even more stark in light of what the Vatican is explicitly inviting the church to do. As I said, the Vatican's Laudato Si action platform is an opportunity, and it's an invitation for 7 different sectors of the church to make a commitment to faithfully live Laudato Si. And you can see among these sectors is parishes and dioceses. So the Vatican is explicitly asking dioceses to make a commitment to live Laudato Si. The commitment entails pursuing 7 different goals, of which the first is response to the cry of the earth. And in the listed actions to pursue this goal includes decarbonization. In other words, the Vatican is calling dioceses to discern decarbonization. And I think here it's important to recognize one of the other goals is ecological economics. This is, to be sure, going to cost some money. But even here, the church's own teaching, I would argue, supports this kind of commitment. In his encyclical Centesimus Annus in 1991, St. John Paul II described that there's a responsibility to protect common goods, such as the natural and human environments, which cannot be safeguarded simply by market forces. And these include immediate profit or immediate return on investment. Later on, in 2010, Pope Benedict XVI described it's not hard to see that environmental degradation is often due to the lack of far-sighted official policies, and here I'll say policies, both civic and church policies, or to the pursuit of myopic economic interests, either civic or church, which then tragically become a serious threat to creation, right? A diocese doesn't want to invest in decarbonization because it doesn't make quote-unquote financial sense. And here Benedict provides a challenge by describing that to combat this phenomenon of myopic economic calculations, economic activity needs to consider the fact that every economic, and I'll say civic and church, every economic decision has a moral consequence, and we thus need to show increased respect for the environment. When making use of natural resources, we should be concerned for their protection and consider the cost entailed environmentally and socially as an essential part of the overall expenses incurred. So when a diocese thinks about, should we commit to net zero, part of the cost-benefit analysis should be considering the environmental and social cost of not acting. It shouldn't just be evaluated in terms of immediate financial calculations. So here, I want to pause again. We've talked about mission fidelity through diocesan commitments to LSAP and pursuing net zero policies. But again, we've gone through a lot of material already. We've still got another section yet to go. So I want to pause and see, are there terms, concepts, ideas that folks would like a little bit more clarity on, maybe terms you'd like defined or anything you'd like sharpened before we move into the last part of our presentation.
Thanks, Dan. I'm saving some that are like generally themed questions, but for clarifying terms, there's a question about what does diocesan decarbonization look like, just as a clarifying term?
That's a great question. It can look like lots of different things. And in part, that depends on the structure of a diocese. In some dioceses, the diocese only owns, in terms of what they own and operate, the administrative building, the chancery building, and maybe the cathedral. So that's the case here in Omaha, for example. The Archdiocese only owns the administrative building. All of the parishes, all of the schools, all of the hospitals are set up as separate legal entities. They're set up as legal souls, which means they govern their own buildings, they control their own budgets, and so the diocese can't just fiat, mandate decarbonization. In other places, the diocese does own a significant number of buildings, and so a bishop could essentially implement a diocesan policy that covers, as Bishop Stowe is doing, all of the parishes, all of the rectories, all of the schools in the diocese. So it can look different in different places, but I think the most important kind of piece of this is the pastoral priority that the bishop signals when the bishop makes this commitment, however many buildings it covers. But that's a good logistical question.
Thank you. There's another question just asking to clarify the terms net zero and carbon neutrality.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So net zero is the higher benchmark. So net zero is the standard that requires a 90% reduction in direct emissions. Carbon neutral means that you don't have to change anything about your energy mix. You can still continue to burn fossil fuels. You just plant more trees that will sequester the carbon and, in a sense, serve as sinks that offset the emissions you continue to pollute into the atmosphere. So net zero is a higher standard because it says you can only offset, you can only kind of make up for 10% of your emissions. You need to directly cut 90% of those emissions. So you can't continue to burn coal. You have to think about switching to solar, wind, or geothermal. So it's a much higher standard. When we talk about science-based targets, this is the science-based target that the IPCC has identified in terms of decarbonization. Does that make sense? Or to whoever asked that, is that helpful?
I'm going to assume so, unless I hear in the chat. But yes, I also have one question about benchmarking decarbonization efforts.
Yep.
Could you discuss that as in terms of like if an organization like a diocese simply reduces carbon footprint, using solar or other means, but doesn't track these efforts, how is this a lost opportunity?
Yep, no, that's a great question. And I would go back to that vision of charitable works and social justice in the sense that social justice is a kind of comprehensive master plan policy that starts with benchmarking, that identifies where are we, that identifies a goal, where do we want to get to, and that identifies pathways to reach that goal. So it's systemic, it's comprehensive. I would say kind of maybe what I would call one-off projects. Maybe we do a lighting retrofit, or maybe we do some on-site solar. That's great. I would categorize that more in terms of charitable works in the sense that it's kind of an isolated action. It's not integrated into a comprehensive, data-driven policy. So any kind of decarbonization is a good thing, to be sure. But in terms of ecological justice, we're really talking about a process that starts with benchmarking, that identifies a goal, and that makes a comprehensive commitment to reach that goal.
Great. Thank you.
Can I give a time check here? I think we should continue.
Yep. So this last part really moves then into the last dimension that I'm hoping connects well with CCL and the interest that folks have. And that's the idea of accompaniment and encounter and synodality. We've talked about this in terms of the church's co-responsibility, the laity and the religious. And we've talked about this in terms of encouraging and supporting bishops in their faithful administration of diocesan resources. And here we can start to think in terms of the synod. We are in the process of the synod. And here the synod, using the church's own language, means journeying together. And that journeying, as the Vatican describes, involves the faithful, involves the faithful people, the College of Bishops, the Bishop of Rome, all listening to each other and all listening to the Spirit. That idea of listening, I think, is really at the heart of this relational advocacy, especially when we think in terms of bishops. Bishops are called to discern what the Spirit is saying to the church, not by themselves, but by listening to the people of God who shares in Christ's prophetic office. When we talked about how the church, all the baptized, have this sensus fidei fidelium, instinct of faith of the church. All the people of God have a sense of what faith is and what an adequate response to God's love entails. So we all have this sense of the faithful, and we're also called to prophetic witness. And prophecy, going all the way back to the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, entails lovingly but firmly communicating the gap between fidelity and reality. Where are we? Where do we need to be? If we're not where we need to be, we need to make some changes. So all of this leads us to be able to say that the people of God have a sense of what an adequate response entails and a duty to prophetically communicate or advocate this to the bishop. This is where we can then really start to think about organizing within a diocese. And I'll put these two resources up, but we've talked with CCL and the Covenant and Laudato Si movement about collaboratively organizing Catholics in dioceses across the country to be able to do this, in a sense, to facilitate a faith-based ecclesial encounter, advocacy that builds what Francis calls the culture of encounter. So if folks are interested in this, we can put this in the chat later. But this is what we're really thinking about in terms of advocacy. And as CCL knows, advocacy has specific asks. And so we're thinking about this in terms of first ask being a diocesan commitment to enroll in the action platform. And then once that's done, the second ask is a diocesan net zero policy as part of the action plan. Once you enroll in the platform, then you develop a plan of implementation, and that plan could, and I would say should, include a net zero policy. So, so this is an opportunity to really engage in the synodal process. But I think it's important, again, in terms of empowerment, to understand that this is what the church is explicitly calling for. So I want to give you some of these examples as a way to wrap up our time together. I've referenced Emily presenting to Francis several times, but what Francis has described is a call to be what he calls protagonists of change. In his World Youth Day message in 2013, he described to young people that your young hearts want to build a better world. It is the young who want to be the protagonists of change. Please don't leave it to others to be the protagonists of change. You are the ones who hold the future. Through you, the future is fulfilled in the world. I ask you to be protagonists of this transformation. We can talk about transformation of the world and civil society, but this also applies to transformation within the church. So Francis is explicitly, I would say, calling for protagonists of change, of transformation within the church. This is true in terms of conversion writ large, but it's especially true in terms of climate, and as a way of building what Francis describes as a culture of encounter. And this culture of encounter has been a theme of his papacy, and it really is relationship. For our purposes in CCL, we can talk about relational advocacy. It's building a culture of encounter. Several years ago, Cardinal Jean-Claude Alarac, who's the Archbishop of Luxembourg, described in a webinar on divestment the need to engage bishops in this encounter process for climate action within the church. So he described that bishops normally are not young people, but we're like grandfathers, and grandfathers normally listen to their granddaughters and grandsons. They have a very close relation to their granddaughters and grandsons. So please, young people, tell your grandfather bishops about divestment. In other words, a cardinal is asking the faithful to meet with their bishop about internal diocesan climate action. Even more pointedly here in this country, Cardinal Cupich, Archbishop of Chicago, in an address that he gave at a conference, a virtual conference with the Covenant and Creighton University back in 2021, described it would be great if a group of young people in a parish, particularly if they have not been particularly active in their parish, would go to the priest and say, we're Catholic and this is an important issue to us. Can we visit with you about this and can we have a meeting about this? You have much more power than you really think, young people, in the minds of the adult world, so don't overlook or underplay your abilities. This is true of young people. This is true of all the baptized. More power than you think to be protagonists of change for climate justice within our own church. And using this culture of encounter, most recently, the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development published the top 13 tools for implementing Laudate Deum. And I think it's noteworthy that the top 4 are essentially calling for this encounter-based advocacy. Number 1, introduce yourself to your bishop. Let them know you have signed up for the Laudate Si Action platform. Encourage the bishop to form a diocesan creation care committee, volunteer to help. Develop a draft mission and vision document for the diocesan creation care ministry for the bishop to review. Then have the diocese join the Laudate Si Action platform, asked to be the contact person on behalf of the bishop. In other words, the Vatican is asking for a synodal process of encounter whereby the faithful meet with the bishop and advocate for internal climate policies. And I think one thing that's important to name, and Steve was especially aware of this in terms of CCL, that we can think about meeting with the bishop, but this encounter in a Catholic context also includes the bishop's staff. The church is, like any other, an organization with an org chart. And so when you think about beginning to build relationships at the diocesan level in order to try and catalyze systemic change, just like CCL folks meet with elected officials, you could, and I would encourage you to try and meet with the bishop. But in addition, just like CCL builds relationship with official staff, you can also begin to think about building relationships with key persons within the archdiocese, within the chancery. Is there a director of peace, justice, and ecology? Is there someone within the curia, within the governance structure, who seems especially sympathetic to Laudato Si? If so, building a relationship with that person might facilitate an ecological relationship with the bishop. So when we think about all of this in terms of encounter-based advocacy, so many of the principles that CCL is familiar with, trained in, apply internally to the church itself. So, so we've done a lot tonight, and I told you unapologetically at the beginning that we would. So we've gone through 4 different dimensions of this, ultimately, as I said, with the goal of developing the theological foundations of this encounter-based Catholic advocacy, which I think for our purposes entails diocesan commitments to the Laudate Si Action platform and a net zero policy. So as I said at the beginning, I'm just incredibly grateful for CCL for organizing tonight's event, for facilitating. I'm grateful to everyone for making the time to be here with us this evening. So with that, I will turn things over to, I guess, Steve and Peter as facilitators to begin to think about discussion or ways of beginning to apply this in folks' particular diocese. So I'll turn it back over to you all.
Steve, is it okay if I'm going to continue to field questions that kind of go in more of a discussion mode, if that's all right?
Absolutely. Yep.
So Dan, I can't tell you how much, I mean, I think it's universal. We're all blown away by the depth of your thinking and research. There's a lot of questions, to no one's surprise, probably. I've been holding back the floodgates of folks who are worried or frustrated with working with their clergy or bishops or diocesan office that reject the kind of, or more or less reject the teachings of Pope Francis. How do you have any advice to work with that? Yeah,
that's a great question. That's a question we get over and over with Catholic Climate Covenant here. I'll put this up in case folks are interested in this organizing. in my experience, there are a couple of things to think about. Number one, I think it is essential to begin the conversation with St. John Paul II, with Benedict XVI, and with U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Because if, in my experience, beginning with Francis makes it seem as if all of this is new. And if it's understood or perceived as new, it can be framed and dismissed as radical. So in my experience, beginning with 1990, World Day of Peace message from St. John Paul II, talking about the climate crisis, his language, is at least a way to get a foot in the door to begin the conversation. So I would start with that. In terms of the kind of nuts and bolts of it, this is where a kind of follow-up meeting or kind of training, I guess, as it were, I think is really the next step in terms of thinking about how to really think critically and use the evidence-based strategies of community organizing and social analysis to really maybe break some of these log jams. There are lots and lots of social movement theories and organizing strategies. So without knowing the specifics of somebody's situation, I'm not sure that I can give a concrete suggestion, but I think in some ways that's beyond the scope of tonight, which was really the hope, is that if folks are making the theological connections, that there might be an interest in following up and really digging into this kind of in the way that CCL does trainings for folks.
I love, thank you for that response. Any response that plugs CCL's methods is also wonderful, so I appreciate it. Dan, there's a question, many of them, but next one may be in a diocese where there's heavy social and labor investment in oil and gas industry, how can the laity advocate effectively for decarbonization? And the balance is obviously tricky.
Yep. Yeah, it is a tricky balance, to be sure. I think as a way to begin to think about framing the conversation, I would encourage folks, if they haven't or they're not aware of it, to read Francis's two addresses from, I believe, 2019 and 2020 to oil and gas executives whom he convened at the Vatican, because he really kind of tries to thread the needle in terms of the realism. And I think one of the most important lines from those two addresses is that civilization requires energy, but energy can't destroy civilization. And so there's a recognition that, we are a fossil fuel based economy right now. That isn't going to change overnight. And yet prudence indicates that continuing along this path is catastrophic. And so I think the conversation that Bishop Stowe is now having in coal country in Lexington is kind of a blueprint for how to navigate this. I think part of the conversation, which unfortunately hasn't really been part of the conversation, is just transition. How do you begin to support and accompany inevitably displaced workers? How do you begin to re-educate and retrain folks? That was something that federal Power Plus Act tried to do several years ago, was to provide opportunities for just transfer. So I think it raises these bigger questions, which are real and which are pastoral. In dioceses like Lexington, you can't get around it. So I think there's a kind of candid conversation about what an adequate response entails, balancing horizons, the immediate versus the long term. So no easy questions or no easy answers, but I think Francis's addresses to the oil and gas execs would be a helpful way to begin to think about framing the conversation.
Thank you. Another question, is it realistic to expect the church to prioritize decarbonization when the U.S. bishops consider abortion to be the, quote, preeminent threat to human dignity?
Yeah, it's a great question, which I think is all the more important given the bishop's own language that decarbonization is the preeminent environmental issue. Their November advocacy. I mean, that use of the word preeminent was not lost on a lot of people. I think a couple of things that we talk about in this work, first of which they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, to the degree that either individuals or the church want to advocate one way or another on any issue, whether it's anti-abortion or anything else, doesn't preclude work and advocacy on another issue or topic. I mean, to kind of put it plainly, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So, I mean, to the degree that the church is advocating on one issue or another. And I think the other point to emphasize is that the church has consistently and explicitly described climate change as a pro-life issue. In his 2010 address to the diplomatic corps, Benedict asked, how can we separate or set at odds protection of life and protection of the environment, including the life of the environment? So if we want to talk in terms of a consistent ethic of life, I think fidelity to how the bishops have talked about a particular issue needs to be put in the broader context of what the bishops themselves in a Laudato resource talk about as protect life, preserve that which sustains life, care for our common home. So they're not mutually exclusive, and I would say they're symbiotic in terms of the church's own teaching. But I understand the question, and I understand the practical challenge, to be sure.
Here's another one of a different ilk. Priests typically spend a lot of time on the road going to and from church around their cluster. Can a diocese offer incentives to a priest to turn to electric vehicles? How might that work?
It's a good question. It's a good operational question. Without getting too far into the weeds, I guess initially there's money to be had through the Inflation Reduction Act. So if folks are familiar with IRA, there is money available to nonprofits. I know other organizations do. Catholic Climate Covenant has a resource that kind of, in general terms, outlines the Inflation Reduction Act in ways that faith communities can try and access some of that funding. With respect to emissions from vehicles, in decarbonization, we talk about different scopes: scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Scope 1 is any emissions associated with a plant that you actually own and operate. Scope 2 is typically emissions associated with energy that's purchased or with fleet vehicles that are owned by an entity. And then scope 3 are kind of all of the other emissions associated with an operation. So it depends on it would depend on the scope of a net zero policy in terms of whether or not priest vehicles would be kind of accounted for in that. There are also offset programs. Flying has TerraPass, other initiatives like that. That if electric isn't for some reason or other viable, there's still ways to, in a sense, kind of offset that. So options to be sure, but that's it's complicated, and I would say is diocese dependent in many ways.
Thanks, Dan. We have a couple questions about asking how realistic it is to get a meeting with the bishop as a parishioner. Is it realistic to send an office an email and give a call and expect to actually have a face-to-face meeting?
I will bluntly say, if not, there's something wrong with the ecclesiology of the diocese. If the pastor isn't willing or able to meet with those whom he pastors. My lived experience is that bishops are generally willing to meet, especially given this synodal process. I think, though, this is where it involves and requires evidence-based strategies in community organizing. So stair-stepping escalation, for example, if you send an email to the bishop or to the bishop's assistant and you don't hear anything, are you out of options? Community organizing would say no. You send a follow-up email, follow that up with a phone call, wait 48 hours, follow up with another phone call, then go in person if necessary to drop off a letter and ask for an appointment time. So, I mean, all of this, again, kind of plugging the CCL, I mean, all of this takes the evidence-based strategies of Sam Daly Harris and all the other organizers and really applies them to the church. So in theory and in praxis, it ought not be that difficult to get a meeting with a bishop. And again, I think this is where the model of the church maps on to CCL, because as a parishioner in a diocese, you're a kind of constituent, right? I mean, a diocese is kind of a legislative district, right? So if I'm in Omaha and I want to go meet with the bishop in Grand Island, he doesn't really have any jurisdiction over me, or am I connected to him? But if I want to meet with my bishop here in Omaha, it's kind of like I'm trying to meet with my elected official. So Catholics from different parishes are constituents. If they leverage their collective power, they can hopefully advocate for change within their kind of unit, as it were, diocese.
Thank you. I like how this questioner is thinking strategy. Can Bishop Stowe, Archbishop Kupic, and other decarbonization ecclesiastical leaders leverage their commitments with their fellow bishops on behalf for all of us? Or how can we best work together and help them?
That's a great question. That's part of the open question that the Covenant and Laudato Si movement are trying to put our heads together and try and understand or try and think through strategically. Yes and no. In terms of, and this is really getting into the nitty-gritty of ecclesiology, but in terms of the structure of the church, each diocese, the bishop in each diocese has a fair amount of autonomy in terms of setting up their own administrative policies. So Bishop Stowe could contact and encourage other bishops to do this. He could never, by any stretch, require or mandate or push a bishop to replicate his pastoral plan in the diocese. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is the organization nationally that represents the bishops together. The USCCB, in terms of ecclesial jurisdiction, can make pastoral recommendations, but it's at the discretion of each individual bishop as to whether they implement them, whether they prioritize them or not. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in terms of prioritizing this at the level of the USCCB, and that's part of what was advocated for at a gathering back in February of bishops and theologians, was to actually make this part of the USCCB's national strategy plan, to make it one of its mission directives. That's something that I repeated in my article in America. So I think to the degree that Catholics made a concerted effort to try and encourage and advocate USCCB to do that, I think having a national priority articulated would hopefully move individual bishops in the diocese. But in terms of the nuts and bolts, a bishop has a fair amount of latitude and jurisdiction to pursue or not pursue specific policies.
Thank you. Sister Anne writes, this is more of a statement, but I wanted to get your feel on this. It says, while seeking to encounter bishops and staff strategically, we probably need to have clear ethical investment alternatives when talking about divestment. Could we have your thoughts on that?
Yes, and I see Aaron Lofus, my theologian friend, colleague from Laudato Si movement, is on here. So we welcome Aaron to unmute and add anything that she wants. And I say that because Aaron and I have gone through the process of accompanying our professional organization, the Catholic Theological Society of America, CTSA, through divestment. So CTSA has divested. In the America piece, I linked to an article that Aaron and I wrote in NCR that kind of documents CTSA's journey. In short, pursuing divestment required us to leave our money manager. So we were originally with Christian Brothers Investment Service, CBIS, which manages like $10 billion in Catholic assets. CBIS opposes divestment. And so for us to follow the Vatican's call and faithfully divest, we had to move to a different money manager. So we went through a whole discernment process of identifying other potential managers. We eventually landed with the Perio Group that allows us to invest according to the USCCB's ethical investment guidelines, but also offers the option for fossil fuel divestment. So the short answer is yes, there are opportunities available. I know the Diocese of San Diego has publicly divested, so it has been done. But I think it would require some discernment with the bishop alongside the CFO and the finance council to be able to discern that. But Aaron, I'm not sure if you want to unmute. I guess you can't yourself, but if Aaron wants to add anything else, she spearheaded this. She spearheaded this while I was still in grad school. So she's been at this divestment push in the church even longer than that. So I'm not sure if you want to add.
Thanks so much, Dan, and thanks for the question. And indeed, divestment is a very powerful sign of the church's witness to the need to radically transition our economic and energy structures and shift to the alternatives that exist and refuse to fund the dangerous and polluting energy structures that are being expanded, not just continued, but being expanded by our fossil fuel corporations. So yes, there are investment services and wealth managers who do know how to invest without turning to fossil fuel investments. One good place to look for resources is the Catholic Impact Investment Collaborative, CIIC. They're online. There are other investment banks. I'm a little hesitant to provide an ad service here in this context, but there are resources, and beginning the conversation is very important. And people can take a step-by-step approach to exploring their values, their mission, what they do and do not want to fund, and teasing out their options. And as Dan said, choosing alternate managers if that's needed, because all too often managers are not fully educated about the options, the impacts, and indeed the crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erin.
Dan, and thank you, Erin. Dan, there's a question here about how do we respond to people who don't understand or connect the dots that climate crisis creates a displacement of populations and climate migration?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And I think that connecting the dots piece is so important. And I think my response to that, in a sense, would be as a teacher, but connecting to the action. If we think about evangelization as speaking and acting, we can think about net zero commitments as the action, but that's the what. But the what provides an opportunity to begin to talk about the why. Why are we doing this? So as we see solar go up on our chancery, for example, it opens up the conversation. Why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this because this is how the church understands its mission, and we're doing it because this is what's happening to our common home. So I think the action provides an opportunity for education. And in terms of Erin's work with Laudato Si movement, I'll also describe or flag the resource, The Letter. If folks are familiar with that, a documentary about Laudato Si that Laudato Si movement was integral in putting together. But for example, at my parish, we've enrolled in the platform, and one of our initial steps has been to have a screening of the letter, because the letter in part talks about population displacement from rising sea levels and the crisis of climate refugees. So I think I think the action is important because that's what's ultimately going to mitigate the crisis, but the action also provides an opportunity for education, both in terms of catechesis, but also in terms of some of the practical implications of what's happening. So action and education can go together now.
Okay, I'd like to bring it to a close at this point. We've got 5 minutes left, and we got a little bit more work to do in general. So this conversation hopefully can go on for weeks and will. So Dan, if you would stop sharing, that would be great. And I'm going to put just a couple more slides out about what's coming next. Okay, the idea about what's coming next is not fully worked out, because really what we want to do is we want to dig into the methodology of how do we get together, how do we get like-minded people together within a diocese, and how do we develop reasonable plans to go and talk to our bishops, talk to our priests. And so this is a work in process. The first thing I want to offer here is the idea that a recording of this session will be available. It should come out probably within 24 hours, and it will, hopefully we'll share the link to that through the same methodology that we invited you in, and it will eventually wind up as a YouTube video, which can be shared broadly. We have another meeting of the Catholic Action Team on May 29th. And if you can kind of stay tuned, and hopefully we'll be able to provide an agenda of what we're going to work on there. But I also have a piece of homework for you. I think each of us should take a look at, think about at first mentally mapping your diocese, your diocesan office. Who do you know within the diocesan office? Who would be a likely candidate to be a sympathetic ear to the message that you develop? And that mapping will be really an integral part about how each of us will proceed with our next step. Okay, so the thing to mark on your calendar is May 29. I'd also want to give John a 1 minute opportunity to plug the CCL National Convention. And it's an amazing thing that any of us can join into. Go to Washington, get some education, and go lobby in Congress. It's a life-changing experience. It's also really good methodology for how do you lobby your bishop. So John, if you would give us your 1 minute plug.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. So I put a link in the chat. Our CCL Summer Conference in Washington, D.C. is on June 8th through the 11th. Registration is open now. There's more details in that link. And I highly recommend if you can make it to the summer conference. It's very empowering. I always come home feeling recharged, refreshed, and ready to do more. It's quite an experience. So I highly recommend it. That's
Great.
it. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. And John, if you could unmute everybody, I'd like everybody to have an opportunity to just give Dan a little cheer and a round of applause.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks
That was
so
incredible.
much,
Thank you very
Dan.
much.
Thank you, Dan.
That was
Fabulous.
inspiring.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dan.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Great
Thanks.
article, Stan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
so good night, everyone.
Night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you for
Good night.
coming.
Webinar. Thank you.
Thanks again.